Good afternoon. Shall we get going on this session, Submarines to Satellites? We'll start now, and it's a 50-minute session, and there'll be plenty of time for Q&A during the proceedings. Yesterday, Terry sternly exhorted us to focus in this conference on the Asia-Pacific region's extraordinary dynamism and its amazing potential. And that is certainly a huge feature of Asia's exceptionalism. But it's exceptional in another way, in the sense that never before has a region which is the engine of world growth been home to some of the world's biggest and most troubling hotspots and strategic rivalries. I'm very lucky here. Dominic Ziegler is my name. I'm the Asia columnist for The Economist. Our column is called Banyan, and there's a very fine example of the tree outside in the hotel courtyard. I'm very lucky indeed to have three real experts who've devoted a lot of their careers to thinking about security issues in Asia and thinking about the scale of militarization that has taken place within the past generation in the Asia-Pacific region. So I'll first of all introduce, if I may, the panelists. Chungmin Lee, on my far left, Professor of International Affairs at Yonsei University in Seoul. Bernard Bud Cole was long the Professor of Maritime Strategy at the National War College. And Eiichi Katahara from the National Institute for Defense Studies in Tokyo. Very welcome indeed. The political hotspots, strategic rivalries. I mean, there are a number of them, as you're all aware. There are divisive historical legacies. Think of China and Japan. There are territorial disputes. It's very hard to think of any country in East Asia and Southeast Asia which is not involved in a territorial disputes. There are great power rivalries, and not just between the US and China, but also, as we've had in some of the discussions today, with India. There's heightened nationalism in a lot of countries. And in East Asia, there's a legacy from the Cold War. Indeed, the Cold War still persists across the Taiwan Strait and, of course, the Korean Peninsula. Now, there was a time when you might hope that rising prosperity would help to ease some of the tensions, smooth over some of the ruffles. But that hasn't happened. On the contrary, what has happened is that growing economies across the region have had increased resources, allowed states to pour money into military modernization and power projection. And accompanying spending, bear in mind that Asia now as a whole spends more than all the NATO members in Europe, 2012. This spending has also been accompanied by a shift in priorities. In the past, territorial disputes, land-based, ground forces were the emphasis, but now the strategic balance has moved out to sea. I'd like to ask Chungmin, who has written a book on precisely this feature of Asia, prosperity and flashpoints. He's written a book, Fault Lines in a Rising Asia. That's recently out. In fact, my distinguished panelists have written so many books on the subject that we have a separate stool for them here, and I shall do some book selling throughout the proceedings. Spending and led to this shift in emphasis to maritime and space.
Well, thank you, Dominic. It's a real pleasure to be here in Los Angeles. I used to work at the Rand Corporation down the street back in '98 and haven't been back since. I wrote the book because I wanted to tell the other side of Asia's rise. And as Dominic just said, I believe that Asia, in one word, is the department store of security dilemmas. And whether it's nuclear issues, whether it's rogue regimes or failed states with nuclear weapons, a la North Korea and partially Pakistan. You have great power rivalries, the US and China, to speak of the most obvious. You have traditional geopolitical hotspots, Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Straits, Kashmir. You have new frontiers, cyber warfare and space. And then you add in the magnitude of the forces that are here in Asia, and it does begin to worry you. Why are the major powers and the middle powers, all in Northeast Asia and East Asia, focusing on modernization and force projection? I believe there are three basic inflection points. Number one, if I go back in history, I'm sure Bud may have a different point. The one person who is responsible for shifting Asia's, I guess, strategic milieu from ground forces to maritime is none other than Mikhail Gorbachev. Because once the Soviet Union began to implode, the Chinese began to shift their strategic attention from ground forces to the maritime zone, which they had never done before. So from 49 till around the 1990s, the PLA didn't really have a navy worthy of its name. And then as China's economy begins to grow, the leadership says, okay, what is the next frontier whereby we can compete with the Americans and their allies in the region? And I guess in that sense, that's why I'm saying that Gorbachev, in a nutshell, is partially responsible for China's strategic shift. That's one big thing. The second thing is all of the richer Asian states are now able to afford much more, I guess, credible military forces. So we're talking about the Japanese, the South Koreans, partially the Australians, and more recently, the Indians. And so they have forces, they have doctrines that are basically quite crucial. The third key inflection point, of course, is North Korea. And when Pyongyang began its nuclear program 20 years ago, and I think at this particular moment in history, after the fifth nuclear test, North Korea basically has triggered alarm bells not only in South Korea and Tokyo and elsewhere, but I think the Chinese are also increasingly concerned at their cousins in North Korea. And you combine all of that, and then you have the Chinese are basically now saying, we will now make sure in the next 20, 30 years that we will be able to compete head-on with the Americans over all strategic fronts, and that's going to be the big game changer, I believe, in the next 20, 30 years.
Very much indeed. But your book, which will be out shortly in November, China's Quest for Great Power, there are copies outside, copies, which will be worth a lot of money. They're rarity. But I'd like to ask you about China. First of all, is it your sense that China is determined to become the dominant agent on the continent? And if the answer is yes, what do you infer about its future direction?
Well, first, I'm honored to be here today and to be on this panel. Also, I'm honored to be the third Navy guy, if you will, after Admiral Harris and Admiral Blair to speak at this conference. The way I usually phrase China's maritime ambitions is that, in military terms, is that Beijing doesn't want events occurring within the island chains of which it does not approve. And by second island chain, the line from the Kamchatka Peninsula down through Japan, the Bonin Islands, Marianas, and then westward through the Indonesian archipelago. So by having as its goal not wanting events to occur of which it does not approve, I don't think that means necessarily the same as maritime dominance, certainly not in the terms of traditional maritime strategists. And if I could just talk for a moment about strategy, I've just about become convinced after many years' study that for a nation to have an effective strategy, the strategy's goal has to be to prevent an existential threat to the nation. I would argue, for instance, that the United States has only had a maritime strategy 3 times in its history. China right now is trying to do something that I don't think any other nation in history has ever accomplished, which is to become a maritime, for an established continental power to become a maritime power as well. They're making a lot of progress towards that, but in terms of maritime strategy formally written, the only thing we have is the October 2015 Defense White Paper that was issued by Beijing, which de facto presents a maritime strategy.
Could I ask you, Eiichi, about defense spending across the whole, as Admiral Harris called it, Indo-Asia Pacific region? A growth in defense spending by China, a response by the US in terms of the rebalance, by slightly increased defense spending in Japan. Is China really the root cause of that of other countries spending more? And a second question is, what are the budget constraints that countries in the region face, not least Japan?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you to the organizer for inviting me. And also I want to say that because I work for the government of Japan, Ministry of Defense think tank, what I will say here is my personal observation, nothing to do with government policy. So even if I criticize the government, it's my responsibility as a researcher. Well, responding to your question, first of all, I just want to make some point about China, what I think about China. In the previous session, according to the opinion poll, both Japanese and Chinese are a very negative perspective each other. But from my perspective, I think it's important to put Japan-China relationship in a broader historical perspective. Japan and China are next door neighbors. We have been living together peacefully for the last 2,000 years, or more than 2,000 years. The war between Japan and China should be considered as an aberration in history. So that's one thing. And secondly, people talk about stronger China. China is getting bigger and bigger and stronger. We get frightened about China. But we are also concerned about weakening China, the possibility of disintegrating, collapsing China. This is also a much more nightmare for all of us. So we are concerned about growing China capacity, but we are also concerned about weakening China. We need a strong, stable China, which can contribute to international order. That's what we want China to be. So if I quote from Churchill or Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So talking back to your question about defense budget, in comparative terms, I think Asian military spending has been growing much larger than the rest of the world. Particularly China and India's spending has been growing. Particularly China's spending is really quite massive. And particularly what concerns me is China is not really increasing its military capacity, but also increasing what we call law enforcement capacity, Coast Guard's capacity. In the last several years, China's Coast Guard capacity has tripled. Let me give you some example. In 2013, Japan has got 51 vessels, larger than 1,000 displacement capacity. China had only 40 vessels in 2013. Then in 2015, China's Coast Guard vessels, more than displacement 10,000, increased to 111, compared to Japan's figure 62. So in terms of Coast Guard capacity, China's power has been very, very rapidly growing. So that's really a concern us, because those we are talking about South China Sea and East China Sea. Basically, Coast Guards are playing the games there. So that's why we are concerned about China's growing capacity. Also, we are trying to help regional countries, Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, by providing some patrol ships to them. Thank you.
Should we stick with... and also around disputed Coast Guard forces.
No, I think the Chinese growth in its Coast Guard is a result of at least 3 points. First of all, the recent consolidation of various Coast Guard-like agencies in China under the State Oceanographic Administration, which ironically pretty well parallels the development of the U.S. Coast Guard early in the 20th century, when various services were combined. So it does reflect a reorganization and a desire to exert more central control over their Coast Guard. Secondly, I think it does represent an attempt by Beijing to maintain a relatively lower level of confrontation. The Chinese Coast Guard ships have not hesitated to deliberately collide with other vessels or use fire hoses and noisemakers and so forth when they confront primarily the Philippine or Vietnamese vessels in the South China Sea. It also reflects, I think, a prioritization for the Chinese Navy not to get involved so much in these lesser confrontations, but rather to continue to focus on what I think remains the number one priority concern for the Chinese Navy, which is a possible Taiwan scenario.
Dominic, if I may, just on the defense spending trajectory, I think there are two major drivers as we forecast defense spending in East Asia. The first is all of these three major countries, China, Japan, South Korea, and even North Korea in that sense, face constraints. In China's case, the big constraint is slowing economic growth. And since 2007 or 8, the Chinese have spent more money on domestic security and surveillance than on external defense. And that trend most likely will continue. So the PLA leadership, as well as the CCP leadership, at some point in time will reach a critical tipping point. And as growth falters beyond 6%, if that goes down, then they're going to ask themselves, where should we put the money? Into PLA modernization or on domestic security? That's one major driver. In Japan and South Korea's case, it's basically aging societies, as we saw earlier today in one of the forums. So you have one of the most rapidly aging and declining populations in the OECD, Japan, and in South Korea. By 2050, 36% of the Japanese and Korean populations will be 65 and over. And so if you look at those trajectories, manpower needs for each other's defense forces will be very, very low, or lower than they are today. And then you have exponentially increasing social welfare spending. So the big debate in Tokyo and Seoul in the next 10, 15 years is social security versus national security. So if those two constraints are overcome, then I think we can have a more realistic base. The third driver, of course, is what the US will do. And if US defense spending, as we see over the next 10 years, is slated to decrease, then what will happen? There will be greater pressure on the Japanese and South Koreans, regardless of whether Trump becomes president or not, to increase the defense cost burdens. So those are the three major, I guess, key points we have to bear in mind as we project Asia's defense spending.
Can I make some additional remarks about defense budget, or what we call the arms race in the making, perhaps? There are at least three important drivers keeping up increasing defense budget in the region. First factor is what we call security dilemma, or action-reaction dynamic operating in the region. China is concerned about Japan's and U.S. combined military power. Also, we are concerned about growing North Korea and Chinese military capability. Second factor has to do with domestic politics. Xi Jinping cannot, well, in terms of consolidating power base for Xi Jinping, he needs support from the military. So he cannot make any concession to the military, to adapt to Japan or the United States. So it's sort of domestic factor is operating. And finally, what we call nationalism is on the rise in the region. Thank you.
Let me just note in support of the previous statement here that when China appeared to be organizing a National Security Council about 3 years ago, there was much discussion about whether this was going how much this would be oriented towards international affairs the way our National Security Council is. And it now appears, however, that China's Security Council is focused almost entirely on domestic security.
Budget for domestic
security, as far as we know, is larger than what we would call the defense budget. The other point I'd make on budgets is that the reorganization that is taking place in China's military right now appears to very likely to follow some diversion or reallocation of funds away from the Army and towards especially the Navy, but also to a degree to the Air Force. One of the prime facets of this reorganization is that the People's Liberation Army now does not include just the Navy and the Air Force, but in fact, the PLA headquarters now has under it all three branches, Army, Navy, and Air Force, have their separate organizational units, which also is evidence that the emphasis on the ground forces is being reduced, and that the Navy and the Air Force, particularly the Navy, I think, is going to benefit from this budget reallocation.
And everyone in the room. Budget constraints. Who believes that in Asia, who believes that there is an arms race? Second question I'd like to ask is, if there is such a race or an arms dynamic, is it contributing to or impacting from security? Just a little vote. Is there an arms race? Who believes that there is? Minority, I'd say. And is military spending in the whole
I guess what I would point out, the one area that I don't like the term race, but certainly if we look at submarine acquisition, we see China got the world's largest submarine force now. Japan is remodernizing its submarines. South Korea is modernizing its submarine force. Vietnam now has 8 Kilo class submarines. They've gotten from, I guess, 6 of the 8 that have arrived. They've gotten from Russia. And what's interesting to me about that is that a training team from India is helping Vietnam train their new submarine crews. And Indonesia and Malaysia have submarines. Singapore has submarines. Thailand is talking about it. Even the Philippines there's been some discussion about acquiring submarines, but first they have to establish a more meaningful navy. So in the area of submarines, certainly there's some competition going on.
Dominic, I would agree that whether you call this a traditional arms race a la the US-Soviet arms race in the Cold War, there are, of course, differences. But the key issue here is, if you look at the big picture, I think almost all of the middle powers and major powers, including India, Japan, for example, South Korea, obviously Taiwan, and Australia, from their strategic perspective, the rise of China and China's growing power projection assets is a critical concern. And that was not the case 20, 30 years ago. So regardless of what the Chinese are doing, if you look at their assets in terms of asymmetrical capabilities, their anti-satellite capabilities, their ability at some point down the road to constrain US naval operations in this region, particularly along the Second Island chains, that's a huge concern to all US allies in the region. So that's one big thing that I think, big question mark, is lying behind the eyes of Asia's defense planners.
And I'd like to add to that something Admiral Blair said earlier this afternoon, which is China's actions almost seem to be counterproductive or counterintuitive to what their goals are. Their development of submarines has certainly led directly to this development throughout East Asia of submarine forces and concerns about defense spending. And perhaps the most egregious example of this Chinese action has to do with the fishing areas in the Natuna Islands that are owned by Indonesia. Here we have a very important nation in Southeast Asia. I don't think any multilateral organization has been organized in Southeast Asia without Indonesia's strong support. And yet China seems almost to be going out of its way to alienate Jakarta with respect to several maritime issues.
How do you think that may... Oh, I'm sorry. How do you think that would play out? How would China adjust its behavior to this kind of pushback that both Admiral Blair and you have highlighted?
I haven't really seen any real effective modification on China's part. I was engaged with a Chinese delegation from one of their military think tanks about 2 weeks ago that was visiting Washington. And the delegation was asked, well, we've outlined all these maritime problems in East Asia, East China Sea, South China Sea, Yellow Sea, Taiwan, and so forth, even the Indian Ocean. And what do you think China might do to help ease the situation in the future? And the response was, well, nothing. China hasn't done anything wrong. Everybody else has to adjust.
You know, Dominique, until 2010, roughly speaking, the Chinese didn't really make an issue of the, for example, annual U.S. South Korean military exercises. And they did always make a fuss about Taiwan, but not about U.S. exercises in South Korea. But in 2010, as the audience remembers, the North Koreans sank the ROK vessel, the Cheonan. They bombed Yeonpyeong Island, and the Americans, of course, and the Koreans reacted in a very controlled way, but to demonstrate U.S. deterrence on the peninsula. And the Chinese went ballistic, literally. Their media, the PLA, they all said basically, this is you're intruding on our waters. These exercises are basically very highly destabilizing to the region, and it is a direct threat to China. And that's what we didn't see before. And so for the first time, the Chinese are claiming not only their stakes in South China Sea, but also in and around the Korean Peninsula, in the East China Sea. And so they're making all these demarcations, which didn't exist, as I said, 10, 15 years back.
Well, maybe this is the moment to bring in THAAD as well, to which China objects deeply, even though not encroaching on Chinese territory. But tell us a bit about the Chinese objections and how
the Chinese
and how the South Korean.
It's really interesting because the Chinese, at least their diplomats, the number one principle by which Beijing's diplomacy works is sovereignty. And they are absolutely clear on this front, whether it's Taiwan or any other issue. But surprisingly, or maybe not, the Chinese ambassador to Korea on several occasions publicly decried the fact that South Korea might deploy a THAAD with the U.S., and Chinese officials from the foreign minister on down have said publicly that this would destroy the relationship. And then we keep on telling them, first of all, THAAD, if it is deployed, it is not targeted against the Chinese. It is specifically targeted against North Korean missiles and nuclear weapons. And the fact that they don't really seem to understand that from our perspective, a North Korea with a growing nuclear arsenal is an existential threat. So I told my Chinese colleagues, what do you want us to do? Do you want the South Koreans to have our own independent nuclear force? Is that what you prefer? Or would you rather have us rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella and extended deterrence, which is mostly what the Korean government and most Koreans want? And then I think the Chinese, after the fifth nuclear test, are now realizing that the rationale for opposing THAAD is becoming thinner and thinner and thinner from their perspective. Apropos, for example, the Japanese have also missile defenses. And then I think why the Chinese chose this is because they really want to make South Korea as a test case. They want to decouple Seoul from Washington bit by bit by bit. And they saw THAAD because THAAD was also and is a political issue within South Korea. And so they wanted to exploit that to the full, but Kim Jong-un didn't really help with the fifth nuclear test.
I'll also note that technically the Chinese objection is not the missile itself, but the X-band radar that supports it. Theoretically, it could cover about 1,000 kilometers of China. But from an American perspective, you've got a regime in North Korea that is deliberately and repeatedly, repetitively threatening the United States with nuclear attack. So THAAD is really sort of a minimal response by the President of the U.S.
Eiichi-san, just before we throw the conversation out to questions from the floor, could I ask you a question relating to the Korean Peninsula? Defense Minister Inada, who has some pretty offensive views on history, was in Washington recently, and she made some quite notable remarks about the need for greater cooperation between Japan and South Korea. So I just wanted to ask you, and presumably one of the motivating factors here is North Korea. What is the potential and what are the limits of Japan and South Korea cooperating in ways that the Americans, for one, have long wanted them to do?
Well, first of all, I think it's nice to have a female defense minister for Japan, because not many Japanese politicians are females. Anyway, going back to your question, I think, Defense Minister Inada has some historical, particular historical perspective. But as a defense minister, he represents the government of Japan, so she needs to restrain what he talks about. And so we are concerned. We want to improve Korea-Japan security cooperation by perhaps establishing dysomnia, agreement, and also access to transmitting some services in terms of contingency or whatever. So, and also another important thing to do is for trilateral cooperation. Japan, US, and Korea trilateral security cooperation is really critically important.
Thank you. To the floor. It's a huge subject. We've covered parts of it. We haven't even talked about India yet. Can I take 3 questions at once? You, sir, first.
There generally has been a 1% consensus for Japanese defense spending, and I just wanted to know, does that consensus still exist, or will it go higher? Thank you.
1% consensus. Yes, sir.
Hi, Andy Oken from the American Go Association. The puzzling Chinese actions that are seemingly counterproductive for them in the international arena, to what degree may they be more directed to China's internal politics, fomenting a nationalist feeling or response, rather than actually devoted to the importance of one or another particular outcome in the external area?
Thank you very much. Admiral Blair, did you want to make a remark? Okay.
Thank you. Robin Park with Grant Thornton. So with respect to North Korean policies with Korea, do you view this as some sort of a game of brinkmanship? I mean, is there a real perceived threat that North Korea would actually, utilize nuclear weapons against any countries? Because if that were to happen, North Korea would no longer, remain on the planet, and that's really their only leverage they have to create noise, I guess, in the international arena. So I guess my question is how credible is that perceived threat, first of all? And secondly, would China even allow North Korea to even make any sort of innuendos that they're going to, initiate some sort of war involving nuclear weapons?
We take these questions in reverse order and start with North Korea first.
Sure. The reason why we, as in, the Koreans and the Japanese and the Americans take North Korea's nuclear threat seriously is for a number of reasons. Number one, their delivery vehicles are now really long range, and Kim Jong-un is now able to have near ICBM capabilities. Number two, he has miniaturized nuclear warheads. And number three, he is able to have submarine-launched ballistic missiles within the next 3-4 year time frame. The reason why, and you have a really good question, I doubt highly whether Pyongyang would use nuclear weapons as a first strike weapon against South Korea. If he did that, our government has said the moment there is any inkling that they're going to use nuclear weapons, we will do a preemptive strike. And if there is a nuclear strike, God forbid, of course, the US will also respond. And Kim Jong-un, I think, is not that stupid, so he realizes that. What worries us is that if you have nuclear weapons in North Korea, the threshold for deterrence becomes weaker from our perspective. So if North Korea does another Cheonan, if they do provocations along the DMZ, and we respond militarily, the key question in everybody's mindset is, will Pyongyang go nuclear? And that is something that we didn't have before. So it gives them additional coverage. At what point will Kim Jong-un do brinkmanship? Will he step down? I think that depends on how much money he has. In other words, as his hard currency earnings dwindle because of these sanctions, and if China really turns on the screws and clamps down on all of the illicit monies that are being laundered in China, that's where he becomes, I think, really panicky. And that's something that we have to watch out for. But the nuclear issue is more of a psychological, political dimension as well as a military threat.
Let me just also point out that the idea of nuclear weapons flying around Northeast Asia is so horrendous that I don't think any official in power can take even the slightest chance. So the credibility factor has to be really minimized from a policy point of view.
I want to address the first and the third question. The third question first on North Korea. I think we are now confronting a clear and present danger from North Korea, because North Korea has, in the process of deploying nuclear warhead, missiles with nuclear warheads possibly, probably they have succeeded in miniaturizing warheads so that they can put on their missiles. That really present really clear and present danger. So we are very concerned about not just psychologically, but also accidental use of nuclear weapons, as well as intentional use of nuclear weapons. History shows that some countries, some political leaders get irrational, like maybe Japan included. So we are concerned about accidental as a irrational use of nuclear weapons. And on Japan's defense budget, I think you can say that there is something like consensus on the question of 1% of GNP. Legally speaking, there's no such limit on our defense budget. But there's some general public acceptance of defense budget, really about 1% of GNP. And also in terms of Japanese domestic politics, Ministry of Finance is very formidable, the most powerful bureaucracy. So compared to Ministry of Finance, Japan's defense, Japan Defense Ministry or Foreign Affairs, they're not really as powerful as Ministry of Finance.
On North Korea, once another test, a fifth test, and more calls for more UN sanctions. We've heard it before. What scope is there still remaining in terms of sanctions that really bite on North Korea? Let's assume that China will not, although in word it might adhere, will not in practice, really cause them to bite. What can the West do in terms of financial sanctions or any others?
Dominique, North Korea is perhaps the most sanctioned country on earth as we speak, and they've managed to survive because of the pipeline they get from the Chinese. So 90% of North Korea's oil and petroleum comes through the borders, as well as their trade and all their hard currency earnings. Now, there are two areas where I think Kim Jong-un will begin to panic. And one, as I said, is if the Chinese begin to clamp down on the illicit accounts throughout China, whether it's in Macau and elsewhere. Number two, the hard currency earnings have come down dramatically over the last 10, 15 years. But for example, you have forced North Korean laborers working in timberland, for example, Russia and the Russian Far East. Partially they're out to, for example, in China. They're also working in the Middle East. And this is where it's basically virtually indentured servitude or slave labor. And so they're the ones who earn all this hard currency, and then they're all siphoned back. Almost all the North Korean embassies, 64 of them or so around the world, they are being run by black market sales on cigarettes or whatever. And so that's the last, I guess, hurdle that the international community faces. The final, I guess, sanction that we have to put them on, for example, is North Koreans who work in the WMD infrastructure. So if you have North Korean scientists and those who support North Korea's WMD program, once you put those organizations and leaders into the sanctions mode, that will also hurt technology transfers to the DPRK.
And what, in your view, would it take for China to change its calculations? I mean, I think I would find it very hard to imagine China giving the nod to regime collapse. What about regime change, installing, China's man in the North Korean regime?
That I think is more in the realm
that even scholars at the Central Party, the Communist Party school, talk about.
Yeah, I think that's more in the realm of the next James Bourne movie than in reality, because first of all, I'm not really sure, maybe Bud has an answer to this, or members of our audience. The Chinese have influence on North Korea, but not nearly as much as we think they do. And so I don't think the Chinese leadership has the ability to change the regime in Pyongyang at their will. That's not going to happen. And I think just in 2 seconds, the gentleman over there asked about whether the Chinese are really doing all of this external stuff for domestic purposes rather than external, threats. My own personal reading is that yes, domestic threats or instability basically is increasing in China, but all the steps they've taken on defense basically is primarily driven by externalities.
I would agree with that to an extent, that it's not a tail wagging the dog scenario, though. I think that the leadership in Beijing, for historical reasons, is so sensitive to any sovereignty issue that they don't want to be seen as weak on issues of sovereignty in some of these land features in the South China Sea or the East China Sea. But again, it's not the tail wagging the dog. The primary concern in Beijing is domestic security.
And in terms of the South China Sea, I mean, it's pretty much all they've got. They haven't got Taiwan. Hong Kong is going to cause increasing headaches for China in ways that should worry anyone who cares about Hong Kong. So the 9-dash line and everything that lies inside it is on the passports, and it matters for that reason. Eiichi-san.
Well, I just want to make my personal observation about China's policy toward North Korea. I think Xi Jinping has been very angry about what North Korea is doing, in terms of also nuclear weapons and also ballistic missile tests. However, China needs North Korea as a strategic buffer. But I think from Chinese strategic perspective, Korean contingency is linked to Taiwan contingency. And China is preoccupied with Taiwan contingency, So as far as Taiwan remains as a biggest strategic question, China believes that US forces on the Korean Peninsula would have to be tied down on the Korean Peninsula, as reinforced to Taiwan contingency. So to that purpose, China needs North Korea as a strategic buffer. So at some point in the future, if we see some improvement between Japan, China and Taiwan, maybe, or stabilize the relation between Taiwan and China, maybe some progress would take place on China's perception of North Korea.
Thanks. I was wondering, we've been talking about one kind of unstable leader in North Korea and how thinking about him alters equations. I was wondering if you could talk about one other unstable leader and one potentially unstable leader, and how much discussion there is in security circles. One being the possibility of Trump and what he said about not taking loyalty to allies in the same way that others have. And the other, particularly because a moderator who's worked on Russia and China borders, to think about, does Putin, when you mentioned, Dominic, that India hadn't even come in, the kind of natural flow of the conversation would in fact bring Russia into this kind of configuration. And so, I mean, I wonder, is for Northeast Asia, is Putin, who looks so worrisome from a European perspective, not a particularly worrisome figure? And also, is there planning going on of what would happen if to these kinds of relationships if we had, to my mind, still unthinkable, a Trump presidency to look forward to?
I think as far as the Russian-Chinese relationship is concerned, it's one of the very few times in the history of the world that those two countries have gotten along. China wants the energy reserves out of Siberia, and I think Putin is just playing, classic balance of power politics to link up with China against the United States. I don't think it's going to last. I think that one area of potential conflict between the two is Central Asian energy reserves that have historically been Russian and now are shifting increasingly towards China.
If you look at the demographics in Asia, Russian Far East, the Chinese over time will have a much larger population base even in that area than the Russians themselves. From an Asian perspective, the Japanese are concerned because of the Northern Territories issue, but the Russian Far Eastern Fleet basically is no longer as powerful as it was back in the Cold War. The Russian military footprint in Northeast Asia is basically very minimal. So I don't think Asians worry about Putin's resurgence as we did, for example, in the Ukraine and Crimea. On Trump, my personal view is that he'd be a horrible president for the U.S. and the world. But speaking as a Korean and a Japanese, he has pointed out 4 countries for free riding: Saudi Arabia, Germany, Japan, and South Korea. I can only speak about South Korea and Japan. The Japanese, Katahara-san, correct me if I'm wrong, they support nearly 70-80% of the cost of U.S. forces based in Japan. We support about $1 billion per year. $985 million to be precise, to support U.S. forces in Korea. The Japanese and Koreans are one of the largest importers of American arms. And I think both the Japanese and Koreans, because of the size of their armies, their government's linkages to the U.S., we are not free riders. Why Trump picks on the Japanese and Koreans, I have no idea. But the fact that if you can imagine a U.S. president who has such a very low, shallow view of the world, that his advisors, for those who we are aware, are not the usual advisors on key foreign policy issues. He has a knee-jerk reaction to the world, and I think that is very worrisome. If, God forbid, he becomes president, I'm hoping that the Congress will constrain him, and the U.S. bureaucracy, whether it's a DOD or the State Department, will be able to calm down his rhetoric. But let us hope that he will not become president.
If I could just address China and Russia briefly, I think that for all the protestations of friendship, the suspicions still run deep along that border, and Chongmin referred to China's bigger population, and that's one reason why Russia will continue to distrust China, although it won't say so in private, and it also resents the transactional nature, I think, of the relationship. And an interesting development is the developing bromance between Abe and Putin. I'm quite surprised at somebody who considers himself to be a realist like Abe that he does believe he can strike a deal over the northern territories. But that's what he's pushing for. And the Russians, of course, want Japanese money. But Russia is now an interesting factor in the dynamics of Northeast Asia in a way that it probably wasn't some years before. We have 2 minutes left, so I can take one more question.
So there was a recent case of a North Korean diplomat from the London embassy of North Korea defecting to South Korea. So I have 2 questions on that. The first question is, either for this specific diplomat or in general, do you guys feel like South Korea gets a lot of valuable intelligence to help them understand North Korea? And the second question is, do you guys have any sort of insights into what North Korea is doing to try to contain these sorts of defections? And I know that's really difficult to answer, but in case you guys have any insights, curious to hear them.
Well, that is a crucial question. This year and over the last year, let me first say North Korea has purged some 700 to 800 officials. And when I say purged, not just being sent to the prisons, but most of them were basically executed. And so these defectors are coming out because of 2 reasons. Number one, many of them are the ones who handle hard currency for Kim Jong-un and for Kim Jong-il. And so the fellow who defected to South Korea, the deputy ambassador in London, he was based there in London for 10 years. He was in charge of Kim Jong-un's, hard currency earnings in London. And other defectors have also come who have not yet been made public. And so that basically is a worrisome trend from Kim Jong-un's perspective, because if your bankers are running away into South Korea's hands, that's the worst possible point. So what has he done to stop this? Well, he's making sure he's clamping down on diplomats. They're coming back for re-education training. They're making sure that their families will no longer be able to join them for example, postings abroad. But there's only a limit. And so once this trend starts, if you are a senior North Korean diplomat posted somewhere in the world, you will worry that if you are called back, there's 2 reasons. One, you'll be demoted or put into one of the concentration camps. So your third choice is jumping ship. And that sends all sorts of signals. So I'm not saying that North Korea is on the verge of a massive defection, but we are seeing much higher quality, higher caliber officials defecting to South Korea than ever before.
I should say that I knew Mr. Day when I was in London, and he was a sort of a decent guy. He talked the talk. With hindsight, it's kind of possible to sort of read a couple of sort of gestures. He had been recalled, and when he came back, I said, "It was nice to see you again." And he sort of made a kind of gesture as if he was sort of wiping his brow. He was very canny. I think this was intentional. I had asked for months and months to meet the ambassador to interview him, and I finally got a phone call in the middle of December and said, "Yeah, the ambassador can see you, December the 25th." And so, as a result, I never had the lunch with him. Ladies and gentlemen, we've run out of time. I regret, but I'd be very grateful if you could all please join me in a round of applause for our fantastic panelists, Eiichi Katahara, Bud Cole, and Seung Min Lee. Thank you so much.